settled in bed? Or have you picked your target yet? Listen, babe. Don't your dog bite? Listen, babe.
This video is brought to you by Patreon. Patreon! I'm a loser, baby, so why don't you kill me? 2, 3, 4! When I was a really young kid, I'm talking 3, 4 years old, I figured out that I could always get my way if I screamed and cried about it. Oh, I lost at Candyopoly? Well, I'm gonna bawl my eyes out until you say I actually won. And it worked! Because I was little, and the adults in the room were too tired to bother teaching me about fair play. My baby brain thought it had found the winning formula. That is, until my friend Jake's 5th birthday party. After Jake blew out his candles and opened his new Power Turtles toys, it was time for games. It was time for hot potato. You sit in a circle and throw a potato around while music plays, and if you're holding the potato when the music stops, you're out. Last one surviving wins. There were a few problems with this setup. One was that we were using an actual, hard, uncooked potato instead of something like a safe plush toy or a hacky sack, so we may as well have been chucking rocks at each other. A second problem was that it was the parents running the music. There's a lot of hot potato toys out there that will play music for truly random intervals, 100% fair. Jake's parents had full control over who won and who lost, and they could do it while playing some truly awful 50s pop songs about silly aliens and cartoon cavemen. Absolutely biased referees that fully intended to let Jake win on his birthday. But they didn't know about me and my cry until I win strategy. And neither I nor the parents knew about Carly Branderpack. I was naive. I was a fool to think that, in the history of humanity, I was the only child to figure out the crying trick. We got into a circle, and the game began. Timmy was out. Angelica was out. The potato landed in Carly's hands, the music turned off, and Carly began to cry. "Oh no, sorry Carly, we turned the music off too soon." The game continued. The potato landed in my hands, the music turned off, and I started to cry. "Oh no, sorry Gregifer, we turned the music off too soon." And so the battle lines were drawn, me and Carly locking eyes, two masters of the craft going head to head. Meanwhile, Jake's parents were still trying desperately to find an angle that would let their own son win. Soon, it was just the three of us, two crybabies and a very confused birthday boy. And to everyone's shock, it was the parents who gave in first. Poor Jake was out. Me and Carly started lobbing this potato at each other like professional ball players. Our eyes red, our noses snotty. We had become true rivals. So set on cry winning over the other that we didn't even notice that everyone else had left the room, and the parents had left the music running non-stop. We were still throwing that potato when our parents arrived to pick us up, pulling us away, kicking and screaming, a true hot potato stalemate. I never saw Carly again, but she had shown me what a bad sport I had been. And as our family station wagon drove off into the California sunset, I knew my cry until I win days were over. Oh hey, it's that Cy Schneider clip. Take a shot. One of the biggest changes made by Nickelodeon in the mid-1980s was that of corporate structuring. Under the leadership of Snyder, all departments communicated directly to him and had little to do with each other. The marketing department wasn't talking to production wasn't talking to finances wasn't talking to acquisitions, and so on. They only went up the chain to Schneider, a sort of wagon wheel style leadership. When Jerry Laybourne took over as president, she opened the door so that everybody was talking to everybody. Everyone had a seat at the table and could add their ideas and input. Get out of here, wagon wheel, it's a big pot of soup's turn. In many ways, this was fantastic, and allowed for creative voices that would otherwise be ignored. A practice that allowed for one of Nickelodeon's office secretaries to become credited co-creator of Double Dare. But this also resulted in a certain level of homogenous programming in the first half of Laybourne's tenure. There's a few reasons for that. Budgets were low, limiting the kind of programming they could make, and an early failure in Turkey television made Laybourne wasn't keen on taking a lot of big swings just yet. But the corporate structure also meant that singular creative voices kind of struggled to stand out in the soup committee. The back half of the 80s were mostly game shows and variety shows. Fun programming, but not exactly boundary pushing. But there was one department that was a little removed from the creative soup. Not fully, but enough that they could experiment a little here and there. And that was the promo department. The folks who made the little commercials promoting Nickelodeon's programming within Nickelodeon, letting you know just when Inspector Gadget is on and that a new episode of Count Duckula is coming up next. And it was within the promo department that three weirdos made something funny, offbeat, and unique. Something that many people have argued is Nickelodeon's masterpiece. So let's talk about the adventures of Pete and Pete.
If you're gonna play some street bowling, don't use your dad's best ball. Once, when he caught us using his brand new Revco Dominator, he got so mad he chased us into the next county.
Nickelodeon presents The Adventures of Pete and Pete, starring Pete, Pete's brother Pete, and introducing Ellen as Pete's girlfriend.
Look, you're a girl and you're a friend, and that's it!
Today's adventure, what would you do for $1?
We knew this kid, Carl Slurm, who ran around his backyard singing to himself like he was on a highlight film. Yeah! He seemed like a dink, but he knew Kung Fu. Hi-ya! So we invited him to play. What would you do for $1?
Wow. It's humiliating.
It's the sport of Danish kings.
Pete's the world champion, but he still smells like liverwurst. Actually, after 2 years of playing, it's unclear what Pete won't do for $1.
The end. For more adventures, keep watching Nickelodeon.
Where's my money?
Premiering in 1989, The Adventures of Pete and Pete was a series of 30 to 60-second shorts that aired during commercial breaks on Nickelodeon. Older brother Pete likes to keep things straightforward, while his little brother Pete is kind of a chaos gremlin, getting tattoos, staring directly at eclipses, and burping so much their dad has to build them a special burping room in the house. Along with their friend Ellen, the Petes have little adventures and cross paths with odd characters, including their nemesis, Hathead, and their sworn protector, Artie, the strongest man
in the world!
No one knows the full extent of his powers. But once he saved us from this maniac schnauzer.
Your kind never learns, does it, Flabby?
By making him fetch a baton he threw all the way to Scandinavia. Another time, he protected us from the deadly wrath of the evil Mrs. Gillespie, without even flinching.
Your weapons are useless against me!
Each short is a little compact story, full of quick gags, and all of them narrated, mostly by Big Pete, but occasionally by Ellen. They have the air of the little exaggerated stories kids tell each other during recess. One time, I was mowing all the grass along the highway, and I blew up a car with my mind. Oh yeah? Well, my uncle who works at Nintendo showed me the new Mario, and you get to kill turtles with a chainsaw. It's that kind of energy. And for little 1-minute stories, it's pretty fun.
He was impossible to beat at hide-and-go-seek.
I see you.
Then he got a job at the airport inspecting luggage. When I caught him watching TV outside the house, I finally figured it out. My brother Pete had X-ray vision.
The Adventures of Pete and Pete come to us from the minds of Will McRobb and Chris Viscardi, who met a few years prior when both started working for the promotional department at Nick at Night. In these early years, when top billing went to the Donna Reed Show, the goal for on-air promotions at Nick at Night was less, hey, look at how great our classic shows are, and more, here's a very old, dated piece of television, let's have some fun with it. That's how you end up with promotions like adding lyrics to the My Three Sons theme, or holding a fake contest to see who can be the best sitcom-style housewife.
The road to excellence can be messy. So let Nick at Night transform you into the perfect woman you always wanted to be. How to be Donna Reed.
It wasn't out-and-out parody, but a playfulness with what was even then outdated iconography. On the daytime side of things, Nickelodeon was no stranger to running short films during commercial breaks. The channel had basically been built on short content, buying broadcast rights in bulk to fill up package shows like Pinwheel, and filling the time between shows with shorts back when the channel was commercial-free. Nickelodeon was very much not commercial-free in 1989, but the tradition of shorts continued well into the 1990s. As the channel found success, it began to transition out of purchased shorts and into ones made in-house as a way to promote the channel, something called image ads. Here's how advertising executive Joe Marconi defined image ads in his 1991 book, Getting the Best from Your Ad Agency. Advertising created to influence consumer perception of the product or service in a way that may or may not approximate reality, usually emotionally oriented, as opposed to corporate, also called institutional ads, which emphasize the advertiser's name and presence more than attempting to influence how the public feels about the product. Or retail advertising, which aggressively emphasizes the sales message and the call to action. So, for example, the classic Fred Allen promos with their orange splats might be considered a corporate ad, as they emphasize the Nickelodeon brand and logo, while a commercial for Nickelodeon magazine would be a form of retail advertising, with Nickelodeon emphasizing the immediate sale of specific products. Image ads on Nickelodeon aimed to emphasize what the channel was about through story. Kids having fun, having little weird adventures, reassuring the channel's young audience that the channel is not just for them, but also about them. We saw this kind of thing with Camp Nickelodeon, short content of children enjoying themselves and being creative. In the spring of 1989, McRob and Viscardi were brought over to Nickelodeon from Nick at Night to try their hand at image ads. The two men started workshopping some ideas. At one point, Little Pete was going to be a dog named Pete, and then they found themselves a director. Catherine Diekman had gotten her start doing musical journalism for publications like Rolling Stone, where she became friends with Michael Stipe, lead singer of the band R.E.M., who in turn asked her to direct the music video for their song, Stand.
And in the place where you live, now face no.
A song about making decisions and taking control of your life. You can immediately see the visual language that would be implemented in Pete and Pete. You have the warm, early days of autumn setting, the close-up of hands manipulating objects, the wistful East Coast suburban neighborhood. It's all there. McRob had gone to high school with Diekman, and after meeting back up at a class reunion, he brought her onto the Pete and Pete project, and she became so involved that I honestly feel Diekman should have been given a co-creator credit. Nickelodeon liked the Pete and Pete shorts and kept them in production, and they were pretty successful. You can tell because, by 1990, new Pete and Pete shorts were given the same kind of promotion as new episodes of full half-hour Nick programming.
Next on Nick's Super Spy Saturday, we'll Gadget uncover the dirty, rotten, mad truth of the Bermuda Triangle. Then find out what evil lurks under the bed for Agents Pete and Pete. It's all coming up in the next half hour on Nick.
24 Pete and Pete shorts were filmed and broadcast over 2 years. At that point, you could probably fill a full half-hour time slot with just the shorts. So Nickelodeon figured, hey, why don't you guys make a full half-hour Pete and Pete special? So, late 1990 in Bayonne, New Jersey, production began for the first Adventures of Pete and Pete special, Valentine's Day Massacre.
My secret was safe forever. Or so I thought. Then I made the mistake of falling for my math teacher, Miss Fingerwood. And things kind of went...
Kablooey!
Yeah, kablooey.
Nickelodeon presents The Adventures of Pete and Pete. Starring Pete, Pete's brother Pete, Pete's brother Pete's tattoo, which can do 17 exotic dances, including the herky-jerky, and me, Ellen. Also starring Open Face, Miss Fingerwood, Mr. Beverly, and Edna, the Fighting Squid. Today's adventure, the Valentine's Day Massacre.
Keep in mind, this was still the promo department. These were commercial writers and music video directors, not the people who made the actual television shows. Back in those days, programming was just this big lumbering machine that made the shows and had a million people giving input, just like it is now. It wasn't designed for speed or creativity, really, and the promo department was just this little punk division in the midst of all this more corporate stuff. So it was free to do what it wanted to do. And in a way, It's probably unprecedented. I doubt it's ever happened again. The promo division was given permission to make a show. With Viscardi producing, McRobb writing, and Diekman directing, Valentine's Day Massacre premiered on Nickelodeon on February 9th, 1991. Big Pete has a crush on his math teacher, Miss Fingerwood, which makes Ellen uncomfortable. School bully Openface, named so because he loves open-face sandwiches, takes advantage of this friendship schism to try and learn what happened to the school's squid mascot, Edna.
And the best part is, if you take the square root of the difference and subtract the coefficient, you almost always get an integer that's prime.
Neat.
Not sure if they'd ever get this opportunity again. Valentine's Day Massacre is packed. Gags upon gags, nearly a dozen oddball side characters, touching on the common adolescent experience of having affection for a teacher, and cementing the best friends or girlfriend-boyfriend will-they-won't-they dynamic between Big Pete and Ellen. It isn't quite as polished as later efforts, not as visually warm as the rest of the franchise, but it was a strong first attempt. Reception was positive, so Nickelodeon let them make another, What We Did on Our Summer Vacation, which premiered on September 8th, 1991. And for my money, this is when The Adventures of Pete and Pete found its final form.
Your shadow gets shorter. Electricity gets louder. Killer bees arrive from the Yucatan Peninsula. And of course, the annual border dispute.
I'm taking over your turf, Tubby!
You'll have to kill me first.
Between my dad and Mrs. Blowtard gets underway. Still, the summer isn't officially summer until Mr. Tasty comes to town.
A story about nostalgic longings for childhood summers, where the Petes and Ellen try to make friends with the ice cream man, Mr. Tasty, only to find that trying to have a parasocial relationship with a mascot is a lot more complicated than you might think.
What can I do for you kiddos?
Let us be your friends.
I know! How about a bodacious blue tornado bar to tickle your tonsils?
Buffalo!
No, that's not enough anymore.
I'm sorry. I wish it could be different, but it's for your own good. Take them. They're starting to melt. Please, they're all you really need.
Instead of the rapid-fire gags, this special opted to marinate in larger, more absurdist images, like little Pete and Artie beating up the ocean to mark the end of summer, or Pete's dad finding an entire car buried on the beach while metal detecting. The cold winter of the last special is traded in for warm tones, and we get our first taste of wistful nostalgia that flavor the rest of the series. And so this pattern continued for a while, McRobb, Viscardi, and Diekman making a special, the special doing well, and Nickelodeon requesting another. What We Did on Our Summer Vacation led to Space Geeks and Johnny Unitas, July 17, 1992, which led to Apocalypse Pete, October 4th, 1992, which led to New Year's Pete, January 2nd, 1993. And it might have just kept going on like this forever. 2 half-hour Pete and Pete specials a year, never really becoming a series because, well, this is the promo department, and promo departments don't make television shows silly. Around this time, Nickelodeon was in early negotiations with television producer Thomas W. Lynch, the co-creator of Kids Incorporated, a Disney Channel mainstay. In an attempt to scoop him from their competitors, Nick asked Lynch what kind of shows he'd like to make, and the first thing Lynch asked was, "Hey, these Pete and Pete specials are great. I'd love to make them into a series if you're not going to do it." At that point, Nickelodeon thought, well, if Tommy Lynch thinks it's good enough to make into a series, why should we give it to him? Maybe we'll make it. And that's the real story. It took somebody else wanting to make it for them to think, well, maybe we'll make it. And that's really what got it to the first season. So Nickelodeon began the full Adventures of Pete and Pete series as an in-house production, while Lynch would instead create The Secret Worlds of Alex Mack, The Journey of Alan Strange, and Caitlin's Way for the channel. 8 episodes of Pete and Pete went into production, with the previous 5 specials re-edited and added in to turn it into a nice round 13-episode season. The Adventures of Pete and Pete's third incarnation, the actual full television show, premiered on Nickelodeon on November 27th, 1993.
When's the last time a squid caused a nuclear explosion? A family drag raced to the Hoover Dam. A 10-year-old stayed up for 11 days. Hey, this kind of stuff happens every week when you happen to be two brothers with the same name. Nickelodeon presents the all-new Adventures of Pete and Pete. At school, on the open road, even in their own backyard.
Let's do it!
Go on the all-new Adventures of Pete and Pete every week. Premiering next Sunday at 6/5 Central, only on Nickelodeon.
Of course, a full series is a lot more work than 2 specials a year, and McRobb, Viscardi, and Diekman would have to start sharing duties. Hoping to keep that indie rock punk magic Diekman brought to things, more music video directors were brought onto the series. There was Adam Bernstein, sometimes credited as Don Pietra, director of videos for Love Shack by the B-52s and Baby Got Back by Sir Mix-a-Lot, plus a bunch of early They Might Be Giant stuff. There was Peter Lauer, who did Run's House for Run DMC and It Takes Two by Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock. There was Phil Morrison, who did Titanium Expose by Sonic Youth and My Sister by the Juliana Hatfield 3. One thing to keep in mind with all of this was that MTV was only 12 years old at this point, and the idea of a music video director transitioning into the larger mediums of television and film was almost unheard of in 1993. David Fincher had only just done Alien 3 the year prior. Spike Jonze, Michael Bay, Gore Verbinski, they were still in the music video industry, still a few years out from making their first films. It was a completely unproven career pipeline. And here was a show packed with music video directors. These are people who have a skill set to create eye-catching visuals, communicating complex ideas in a short amount of time, and presenting the most thrilling, emotionally impactful images in time with music. The result is a show that could supply material for a couple of really good episodes of Every Frame a Painting. Pete and Pete looks great from a filmmaking perspective. For example, let's take a look at King of the Road, the first non-special episode of Season 1, directed by Peter Lauer. It's a road trip episode. The Petes are taking a family trip to the Hoover Dam, and that's already a huge logistical challenge from a production standpoint. The majority of the episode takes place in an actual moving vehicle, and the production had to find as many different angles as they could to keep things visually interesting. Interior shots, exterior shots, through windows, actors reflected in mirrors, from below, from above. It's a lot of work to keep things looking interesting. Not to mention hiding the fact that the car is actually going like 15 miles per hour on the highway. But it's more than just an impressive take on a logistical problem. Scenes outside of the car are also framed in interesting ways. Take this shot, with the Wrigley family having lunch. You have the car on one side, the trash can on another, and an overpass overhead, encasing them. It's as if they're framed in a grimy, post-industrial wasteland, which sounds extreme. But then the episode introduces a second family, a mirror of the Wrigleys who live up to the 50s suburban ideal that Mr. Wrigley strives for, down to the pipe-smoking father. Their lunch is framed in greenery, bushes and trees behind. It's a deliberate contrast that sets up the Wrigleys as the underdogs of what end up being a contest as to which dad is the true king of the road.
Well, that's the way you want to play, partner.
With just 1 mile to go, the dad who got to the dam with the biggest roof rack stack would be the one and only king.
Pete, hand me the cooler. I'm going up. Honey, take the wheel.
Take him down, Don. Take him down hard.
The Adventures of Pete and Pete is a very visually oriented, director-driven show, and among the best-looking Nickelodeon programs in its long 45-year history. You have no idea how much I crave a high-definition release of this show. Of course, great visuals need great writing. Among those joining Will McRobb and Chris Ficardi in the writer's room were guys, mostly guys, what can you do, who would later go on to make some pretty major works you might have heard of. Joe Stillman became one of the co-writers of DreamWorks' Shrek. Tom Hertz would go on to create the show Rules of Engagement. Duo Sam Johnson and Chris Marcel would go on to be producers and writers for News Radio, Frasier, and What We Do in the Shadows. And David Hemmingson was just nominated for an Academy Award for his screenplay for The Holdovers. If you were to reduce the average episode of The Adventures of Pete and Pete into a simple formula, it would be to take a common experience from youth and blow it up with cartoony melodrama. And with the show's dual protagonists, you can cover ideas from both early childhood to mid-teenagerhood. For Big Pete, you have stories about anxiety over schoolwork, dialed up to 11 over concerns that if Pete fails a single test, he'll be doomed to a life of janitor work.
You took history, right?
Well, you don't take history, it takes you deep into its tangled web. I should know. I got trapped. I couldn't get out. I just kept looking at the clock going round and round. Tyranny of time.
Thanks.
Meanwhile, little Pete is more concerned with pushing against the authority of grown-ups. Just why does Pete have a set bedtime? Why can't he stay up as late as he wants? Perhaps it's because there's a secret conspiracy of adults who want to make kids' lives as miserable as possible.
Well, I tell you what I do, Nancy. I buy the 2%, and I tell them it's whole milk. They never know the difference.
Hey, what they don't know can't hurt them.
And even though Pete discovered why his cereal tastes like sludge, the bedtime rule remained a mystery.
Of course, it's not actually children making this show, but grown-ups pulling from their own childhood, which gives everything a certain sunny nostalgia vibe. There's something to be said about the generational shift that was going on at Nickelodeon in the mid-90s. If you stick with the very strict 1946 to 1964 framing, then the people making Pete and Pete, including McRobb, Viscardi, and Diekman, were all baby boomers, but late baby boomers. Those nebulous last few years where you were a little too young to care about Watergate and a little too old to be a disaffected Gen Xer. This was a micro-generation that was still enjoying the financial windfall of the post-war economy, but the iconic image of the white suburban nuclear family was being thoroughly dismantled in the wake of the civil rights movement, second-wave feminism, and the youth counterculture. Events these latecomers wouldn't have actively participated in, but would have been witness to. You can definitely read a lot of that into the show. The Wrigleys have a sort of failed nuclear family thing going on, especially the family's patriarch, who's all about road trips, barbecues, and bowling clubs. And King of the Road wasn't the only time the Wrigleys were antagonized by the perfect 1950s father knows best style of family. In the first episode of season 3, 35 Hours, the Wrigley house is taken over by a 50s style family who... Wait, is that Patty Hearst?
Come right in. Like my Roy always says, when you've got fresh cookies,
you can't go wrong with fresh milk.
My point is that The Adventures of Pete and Pete was created by a generation nostalgic for the deconstruction of their generation, both basking in that early autumn glow of youth while also going, actually all that stuff was pretty goofy, huh? Chris, Will, and Catherine probably made the show and designed the show at the right time. They, in their 20s and 30s, were still close enough where they could still clearly feel that nostalgia and see what resonates, what is fake, what is being used by the next generation that doesn't ring true. Of course, to pull off good writing, you need a good cast, including the right child actors to lean into the show's weird tones. Big Pete is played by Michael Morona. He had done some prior commercial work and had gotten a little bit of a spotlight between the shorts and the special eras of Pete and Pete when he played Jeff, Kevin's older brother in the first 2 Home Alone movies. As Pete and Pete's given narrator and main character, the show asks a lot of Morona, who delivers a sort of spacey performance, like someone who's always lost in their own head, the cerebral teenage philosopher.
Hello?
Pete, there's a phone crisis at Patterson Field. We could really use a volunteer.
I'd like to, but I'm on to something. I can see this little half finger in the middle.
Big Pete's stories were largely that of self-discovery, a young man trying to figure out the kind of person he is and what he wants to be when he grows up. Does he want to be like his dad? Does he want to pursue academics? Does he want to ask that cute girl across the street out? Stories that wouldn't be too out of place in most coming-of-age dramas, but most coming-of-age dramas don't have the sharp contrast of the little chaos gremlin that is Little Pete. Little Pete is played by Danny Tamborelli, who had television experience before he started forming memories. At the age of 4, he played little kid Sean on the daytime soap opera Ryan's Hope, and then was Jackie on the Babysitter's Club TV show on HBO. When you're little, the rules seem arbitrary. Why can't I stay up later? Why can't I burp all the time? Why can't I get a tattoo? Little Pete's stories basically go, actually, yeah, that is silly, kids rule, grown-ups drool, I'm gonna dig a tunnel under the lawn to get out of being grounded.
With the 4th of July only 2 days away, Pete was 10 feet from freedom and working round the clock.
Awesome.
There's certainly weirdness all throughout the adventures of Pete and Pete, but it's Little Pete's part of the show where things get proper cartoony and goofball. Whereas Big Pete is worried about being seen by his classmates working at his dad's driving range and being embarrassed by that, Little Pete and Artie are more concerned about a turtle that got hit by a golf ball and now has amnesia.
Clark! Clark! No, I'm sorry, my little reptile friend.
You know this turtle?
Know him? Know him! Clark, tell the boy about Paris. You, me, Hemingway, the shiny tugboat. Yeah. Clark! What's wrong? Don't you remember me, boy? It's me, your old pal, Artie.
Artie, the strongest man in the world, is played by Toby Huss, who had created the character years earlier for No Shame Theater, sort of an open mic theater show out of the University of Iowa. The character was inspired by some absurd pajama pants, as you do.
It was cold, and it was in the wintertime. It was very cold in this little apartment. It was up in the corner of this little room in Iowa City, and I had these long johns, and I don't know what it was, if this was the 70s style still, but they were extra crotchy. They were red long johns, but they had this super crazy crotch, and really, if you wore them around your waist, there was all this puddle down here that nobody wanted, so it was natural to pull them up past your nipples. And once they were there, once you were trying to make Mary Jo Berry laugh, then you started becoming a strong man, and then I started saying I was the strongest man in the world.
Huss has an amazing physicality with this herky-jerky stiff movement that makes him feel like an action figure come to life. Artie is the show's representative of its weirdest elements. Early on you might question if Artie is real or Little Pete's imaginary friend, but once characters like the parents and the neighbors start interacting with him, you realize no, Artie and other characters like Artie are an actual textual part of this world. In the Adventures of Pete and Pete, all imaginary friends are real people. And sometimes they go away like imaginary friends. With Toby Huss wanting to move on to other projects, Artie would be written out of the show's only two-parter, Season 2's Farewell My Little Viking, where Little Pete has to defend himself from a paper-cut themed bully after Artie gets sidelined by parents looking to assimilate him into society.
That's why I'd like to be your friend and offer you a job. Sorry. Too busy, too dang busy. Oh, no pressure, Artie. But if you act now, I'll throw in a free pair of slacks. Whoa! Whoa! Of the permanent press variety? As permanent as the stars.
Witnessing Little Pete's victory against the bully, Artie realizes that he's just not needed anymore, and they have a tearful goodbye.
Everything you need to learn is in here. Out there is some boy who needs me. He's small. He's puny, like you were.
But Artie, you're my best friend.
I always will be, my little Viking.
For many viewers, this two-parter would end up being the emotional high point for the entire series, something the show's creators wouldn't glean until much later. We're guys making this show for Nickelodeon, this thing in a little bubble. We didn't really hear what people thought of the show episode to episode. We just finished the season, then do another season, and sometimes we'd hear from people, "Oh, Artie leaving was always so sad." But it's only as the years go on that we realize how profound and how sad and how meaningful those two episodes were to so many of the fans of the show. We had no clue until years later. To fill in the role of Little Pete's best friend, a young Michelle Trachtenberg was cast as Nona, a neighbor girl who wears a cast, not because her arm is broken, but because she likes to scratch the itches it gives her. Nona is a fine part of the ensemble, someone on Little Pete's level, though sadly she didn't have as many standout moments as other characters due to her shortened tenure on the show, these days known as best remembered for her dad being played by Iggy Pop.
I'm sorry, Gumdrop, but I'd have to be an idiot to let you go trick-or-treating.
Known as Pop pulled the plug on her Halloween plans.
Love hurts.
Speaking of best friends, Big Pete's best friend is Ellen, played by Allison Finelli. They've been best buds forever, and while Ellen is a touch more responsible, she's usually the one in the friend group with a job, she's still very up for all the shenanigans the Petes get into, a fellow partner in crime. She also bucks some of the stereotypes you'd expect from the girl character, while also not falling fully into the tomboy archetype. Ellen excels in shop class, while in one episode, directly challenges the academic institution by asking, why do we need to know this?
Why do we have to learn all this stuff? Right now, thousands of trees are being cut down in the Amazon rainforest, and ice caps are melting. And I don't know, another shopping mall is going up somewhere. What do word problems have to say about that, Miss Fingerwood? Word problems are so important. Can you name one time in your entire life when solving one actually made a difference?
It was the one question everyone had always wanted to ask.
Ellen is a very well-rounded character, and arguably the most grounded of the entire cast. However, the show couldn't help itself taking their one main girl character and trying to make her a love interest for the show's lead boy. Now, I'm not opposed to romance plots, even in kids' shows, but The Adventures of Pete and Pete didn't really handle it as well as they could have. The idea had been fermenting as far back as the very first short, where young Ellen introduces herself as Big Pete's girlfriend, and Pete responds that they're just friends. And that could have been a good slow burn, as the kids get older and their feelings mature and they figure out just who they are. However, the show instead decided to dive into things immediately. Day of the Dot was the second non-special episode of Pete and Pete, and the first episode to go into production after the series was greenlit. A remake of one of the shorts, it saw Big Pete and Ellen put at odds after Ellen gets a special role in the school's marching band, and she winds up in the possibly romantic sights of another classmate. After much conflict, Big Pete makes a grand gesture during the marching band performance, and he and Ellen kiss.
Ellen?
You don't have to say, Pete. I know.
We have fusion!
Now, from the standpoint of production, for Chris Viscardi and Will McRobb, who co-wrote the episode, and Catherine Diekman, who directed, this had been a long time coming. We're just like, we've been waiting so long to get them to kiss, we didn't care. For the audience, it was the first or second episode. To us, it's like a moment 5 years in the making. However, while it might have been a long time from the perspective of production, from an audience perspective, this was incredibly early for this kind of thing, and was ultimately a kiss the series would kind of forget, because will they, won't they is too enticing to just chuck away immediately. There was also the matter of the comfort levels for the young child actors, with Michael Morona and Allison Finelli in their early teens. Their feelings on it were probably not considered as thoroughly as they should have been. We were all really close, and it was really hard for Michael Morona and me when they started writing the romantic stuff on Pete and Pete. The kisses were absolutely horrific for both of us. Both times we avoided each other for the entire week. It was pretty difficult. As soon as they'd get their take, we'd be embarrassed for a couple of hours after. Michael asked Catherine to shoot the kiss scenes early in the week so we could get them over with. In Day of the Dot, they did that very last, so we were tortured the entire week. We got over it fine. Big Pete and Ellen's relationship would be reopened in the Season 2 episode Time Tunnel, which pretty much ignores the kiss from Day of the Dot, as Big Pete asks Ellen out on a date to the local drive-in movie theater. But you kind of need a car to go to the drive-in, so Pete borrows it from school bully Endless Mike, played by Rick Gomez. Endless Mike ends up giving Big Pete some very bad, very inappropriate advice that nearly ends Pete and Ellen's friendship.
What are you doing?
It's the final test for us, Ellen. You hit the go, And then you know.
What are you talking about? Pete, you're not acting like yourself. You're acting just like, I don't know, you're acting like Mike.
Mike?
Mike?
It's a better episode than Day of the Dot, more emotionally complex, ending on a more ambiguous note that suggests that maybe these two children shouldn't really be worrying about romance at all. Not at this age. Save for one minor subplot in a Season 3 episode, the will they, won't they stuff stops factoring into the show, and Ellen and Big Pete are just friends from this point forward. Going from friends to family, Pete and Pete's father and mother are played by Hardy Rawls and the late Judy Graff. And these two are not written equally. So many episodes of this show focus on the relationship between the Petes and their father, Don Wrigley, and his desires for a 50s sitcom-style, father-knows-best patriarchal household, despite how much Dad sucks at it.
No. The one who gets Rolling Thunder has to prove to me that he has the qualities that make a Wrigley a Wrigley. Things like honor, valor, courage, and good hygiene.
Translated from Dad speak,
Courteousness.
that meant whoever sucked up to him the most would get the ball.
To make my point, here's every single episode of the show where Don Wrigley is the focus. The fourth special, Apocalypse Pete. Little Pete and Dad get closer during a prank war between them and Ellen's father. Season 1, Episode 1, King of the Road. The family goes on a road trip where Dad's title of King of the Road is challenged by another, even more patriarchal father. Season 1, Episode 4, Range Boy. Big Pete is embarrassed to be working at Dad's driving range, which hurts Dad's feelings. Season 1, Episode 7, When Pete's Collide. Both Petes compete to be the better son so that Dad will hand down the family heirloom bowling ball to them. Season 2, Episode 1, Grounded for Life. Dad is forced to ground little Pete during the 4th of July despite it being a holiday they've always shared together. Season 2, Episode 4, The Big Quiet. Big Pete wants to improve his relationship with Dad, but struggles to find things to talk about. Season 2, Episode 9, On Golden Pete. Big Pete and Dad's usual fishing trips are in jeopardy when Big Pete starts to feel differently about killing animals. Season 2, Episode 10 and 11, the Farewell My Little Viking two-parter, where Dad is forced to drive Artie out of town, then comes around and brings Artie back. By my count, 9 episodes of the show's 39 episodes are Dad episodes, nearly a quarter of the show. Mom, on the other hand, arguably gets 2 episodes. Season 1, Episode 3, The Nightcrawlers, sees little Pete challenging Mom's bedtime rules, trying to stay up as many nights as possible. And Season 2, Episode 3, The Call, in which we discover that a mysterious ringing telephone booth has something to do with Mom's past.
Hello? This is kind of personal. Would you mind? Uh-huh. You know, you could have just called me at home.
It's a shame that Joyce Wrigley gets so little focus, because Judy Graff was a great presence on the show. Instead, most of her scenes are jokes around the metal plate in Mom's head, which picks up radio signals and ham radio chatter. It's funny, but considering how much focus Dad gets, they could have done a lot more with her. The Adventures of Pete and Pete had a fantastic regular cast, and a hell of a guest cast as well, including some well-scoped before they were big names, including a pre-Reservoir Dogs Steve Buscemi, a pre-Spider-Man J.K. Simmons, a pre-Drew Carey Show Drew Carey, and a pre-Cruel Intentions Selma Blair. Plus Ellen Cleghorn, Janine Garofalo, Martin Donovan, William Hickey, Vincent Pastor, Chris Elliott, and yes, kidnapped victim turned fugitive Patty Hearst. The show had such an eclectic secondary cast that there was a long-standing rumor that Hunter S. Thompson was in an episode, which sadly isn't true. And that's not including all the musicians on the show. Will McRobb and Catherine Diekman also had strong ties to the music industry, so a lot of figures in pop and indie rock show up in small roles as well. You got Michael Stipe, Kate Pearson, Debbie Harry, Susie Roche, Sid Straw, Marshall Crenshaw, Gordon Gano, Juliana Hatfield, David Johansen, LL Cool J, and Iggy Pop. I don't think there's a single episode where you don't point at the screen and go, hey, I know that person. What are they doing on this show? Oh look, it's a young Alicia Keys. The bulk of the music was handled by the show's house band Polaris, which consisted of most of the members of college rock band Miracle Legion. Miracle Legion had recently found themselves dealing with issues involving their record label, which prevented them from making new music under that name, so they legally became a different band called Polaris and went on to work on The Adventures of Pete and Pete, composing most of the soundtrack, including the show's theme song, Hey Sandy, well known for its vague, mush-mouth lyrics that have puzzled my generation for decades. The band would show up as actual characters in the Season 1 finale, Hard Day's Pete, where Little Pete stumbles onto them in a garage playing what would become Little Pete's favorite song. However, the band just as quickly vanishes, and with no recordings, Little Pete only has the memory of the song to hold on to. So he forms a band for himself to try and recreate it, and through it discovers the joys, human connections, and emotional core to making music. For a show built out of the periphery of music, written by music journalists, filmed by music video directors, packed with rock and roll guest stars, an episode like Hard Day's Pete was necessary. And it's fantastic.
Every time I guess in every little mess I made, I was around, I was around, I was around, I was around. Nobody knows, nobody knows, I was around. Nobody knows, nobody knows, I was around. Nobody knows, nobody knows, I was around. Nobody knows.
As the music echoed through the night, Pete didn't care if the whole world knew his song was around. Even the entire universe could listen in. The song was his, no matter who else heard it. And now that it had found him again, he was going to make sure he never, ever let it go.
Nobody knows, nobody knows, nobody knows, I was around. Nobody knows, nobody knows, nobody knows.
2, 3, 4! You don't need me to tell you that schools have their social hierarchy. There's the upper rung, the cool rich kids who got their first car as a sophomore and always win as class president, the sports superstars who date the cool rich kids, and the academic heroes that get all the scholarships and all the attention from the teachers and leave you to figure out Blum's speed-up theorem all by your lonesome. The academic heroes are not to be confused with the nerds, mid-rung. Very smart, but not the social butterflies, so the teachers don't really care about them. And the nerds are not to be confused with the geeks, who come in several subsets. You got your anime geeks, and your Caverns and Krakens geeks, and your heavy metal geeks with rude t-shirts. They aren't the popular kids, but they had each other. And then you had the bottom rung, the weirdos like me, who didn't have a single group, but instead drifted around the geeks and nerds like a free agent in baseball, being kind of what they're into and auditioning your way in. Oh, hey anime geeks, I read this manga about a cute robot maid. Can I be in your... Oh, you're all about Sailor Ball instead? Oh, well, I don't know anything about that. That was the hard way to get into these groups. The easy way was to have a trick. You know them. There are probably one or two in your friendly acquaintance circle. Those kids who don't really contribute to the social niche, but had this one gimmick, this one trick that was entertaining enough to keep them around. Tossi Navarro would turn his eyelids inside out. Bitsy Petersdorf would chug an entire 2-liter bottle of store-brand root beer in under 30 seconds and then burp out the national anthem. Bruce Murphy was small enough to climb into the vending machines and get you free snacks. I tried to find my own trick, so that I could at least be a funny little guy that people like to have around. But the best I could come up with was hitchhiker's thumb. Not a lot of hitchhiking going on in my school. I spent my freshman year adrift, holding out my thumb in hopes that someone in this school would pull over and pick me up. What a useless thing. What a stupid trick. Sophomore year, I did eventually find a geek group to hang out with, the Bad Movie Geeks. The kids who got together every other weekend to watch old sci-fi movies on VHS and make jokes. It felt good to have some friends finally. Then one day, Chris Potassium ran into the rec room with a flyer. Plan 12 from Deep Below was playing at midnight at the old movie theater 3 towns over. That was one of the worst movies of all time. We had to see it. We asked Chris's older brother to drive us, and then piled into his 1972 Dorf Discovery, which still smelled of the hippies who used to own it. Well, we were halfway to the movie theater when kablammo! The van's engine fell apart like it had been made out of toothpicks. Pulled over to the side of the road, and with no phones, it seemed like we weren't going to be able to catch the movie in time. Wait, is that a truck coming? How do we get its attention? Well, how about that?
And now, back to Pete and Pete on Nickelodeon.
Nickelodeon didn't really seem to know what to do with the adventures of Pete and Pete. It existed a bit too far out of the system, sidestepping the usual pre-production focus group processes. The green light held back as long as possible while the production team was pumping out these half-hour specials. Put against shows like Hey Dude and Clarissa Explains It All, Pete and Pete felt like an outlier, some weird outsider art that slipped into this wholesome family channel. The series initially aired at 4 p.m. on Sundays, sandwiched between Rocko's Modern Life and Legends of the Hidden Temple. Better than Sunday mornings, but not quite a primetime slot. Then, in the summer of 1995, it moved to Snick, Nickelodeon's Saturday evening block for teenagers, where it replaced Roundhouse. This seemed like a very good spot for the show, but it would be dropped from Snick 6 months later in January of 1996, shuffling off back to Sundays. By then, Season 3 was nearly half over. Season 3, while still pretty good, did come with a number of changes that I personally think were a downgrade for the show. The series switched up its emphasis from Big Pete to Little Pete, giving us more Little Pete adventures and expanding on his cast. Little Pete's lucky penny runs out of good luck, so he and his friends go on a trek to lay it on a railroad track to try and recharge it. Little Pete tries to plan the biggest April Fool's prank the school has ever seen. Little Pete and friends accidentally get locked into the school after it closes and decide to pull an all-nighter. There are urinal shenanigans.
I've never seen anything like it. What is it? It's a foot washer. Yeah, that white puck thing makes your feet smell pine fresh.
With Little Pete taking up the spotlight, the series decided to give him a reoccurring bully character, his own Endless Mike. They didn't quite pull it off. Pitstain, played by Eric Kushnick, feels a bit like a step backwards, back to the specials when the bullies had personalities built around the kind of sandwich they ate. Also, I'm not sure the actor's exact age, but Pitstain reads so much older than the rest of Little Pete's supporting cast, a high school student hanging out with 6th graders. This becomes a problem when we learn that Pitstain has an unrequited crush on Nona. Nothing comes of it, but seeing a guy who looks 17 confess his love to an 11-year-old is, well, it doesn't work.
You are the sunshine of my life.
Eat sludge, Stinkfist.
And speaking of Nona, she completely vanishes after Season 3, Episode 7, Last Laugh, that April Fool's episode. So it turns out, Nickelodeon, seeing some star possibilities in Michelle Trachtenberg, pulled her away from the show to star in the first Nickelodeon movie, 1996's Harriet the Spy. Will McRobb was pissed. Make no mistake, we found Michelle. We auditioned her, she had never done anything before, maybe some commercials, and we got her on the air and everyone loved her. Then fucking Nickelodeon comes in. We have this Harriet the Spy movie, we want Michelle. She was such an integral part of the show at this point. She just helped us get so much of a different dynamic out of Little Pete. It was never quite the same after she left. The show tried to promote some of Little Pete's other friends. You had Girl Scout Monica, played by Maris Hudson, and Wayne the Pain, played by Justin Restivo. But without Artie and without Nona, the Little Pete stories just kinda lost their air. It wasn't all bad. Adam West shows up in 2 episodes as Little Pete's antagonizing principal, and he's great. He falls right in line with Pete and Pete's classic weirdness.
Your attention, please. It gives me great pleasure to be standing here today because when you say up with hygiene, you might as well be saying up with life. And now, without further ado, I'd like to present the Up with Personal Hygiene Singers!
On the Big Pete side of things, it's not much better. With the Big Pete and Ellen romance stuff put on the shelf, the vast majority of Big Pete stories this season involve him pursuing the cute girl of the week. He blows off fun and games with Little Pete to hang out with this girl. He tries to impress this girl at the tennis court. He meets this girl while serving as a lifeguard at the city pool.
What's the matter? You look kind of worried.
Worried? Yeah, I am worried. Worried about the safety of the people in this pool. Yeah, it's an important thing to me.
You won't believe it. The warm spot you're standing in is only 3 minutes old.
It gets very monotonous very fast. So much so that episodes where Big Pete struggles to get his driver's license or tries to excel at amateur wrestling feels like a breath of fresh air. Ellen has it worse though. With the romance stuff off the table, she just doesn't have a lot to do if she's in an episode at all. One time she's reluctantly Big Pete's wingman, one time she gets flustered because she isn't doing perfectly in driving class, and then there's the final episode, which we'll get into, but that's about it. The show just didn't know what to do with her. The role of the parent characters are also greatly reduced. The only Season 3 episode where they play a big part is Season 3, Episode 11, Oh Christmas Pete, in which the Wrigley family decide to extend the Christmas holiday beyond December 25th, refusing to take down their decorations and throw out their tree, which angers the local garbage man.
Oh, okay. So you want to play your little reindeer games? Okay, I'll play. But you better like the smell of your own trash. Because until I get that tree, your garbage stays right where it is. Garbage man has spoken.
He can't leave it there, can he?
Season 3 does have its good episodes, my favorite being Das Bus, where Big Pete becomes an apprentice bus driver under Stu Benedict, played by Damian Young, who goes wonderfully ham as Big Pete betrays his duties for a pretty girl. But it's the best of the pretty girl episodes. With the diminished roles of Ellen and the Wrigley parents, the vanishing of Nona right as the show was pivoting to Little Pete, and Big Pete's turn from young philosopher to horn dog, Season 3 is just much lesser than the 2 that came before it. And if I'm being honest, I think Artie was a bit more vital to the show's success than they realized at the time. Still, it managed to have a pretty dang good final episode. Season 3, Episode 13, Saturday, breaks the format up a bit with the cast going off and having their own little solo adventures that occasionally cross paths. Big Pete is trying to find a way to start conversations with his tight-lipped barber. Ellen's job as a pizza delivery girl sees her racing across town. Stu Benedict is stuck behind a ridiculously long red light. Monica pretends to be a ninja while Wayne the Pain tries to get around town without dirtying his new sneakers. It's a day in the life of Wellsville, bringing things back to silly little adventures and attempts to connect with the people around you, however weird they may seem. It's just a sweet, low-stakes note to end the series on. Of course, it wasn't made with the intent to be a series finale. If we had known that was the last episode, and we tried to write a goodbye episode, I don't think it would have been nearly as good as it was with us not knowing. We would have tried too hard to do more with the goodbye rather than just write a great episode. It was that kind of weather where it had snowed a couple of days earlier, and then it had rained and everything was frozen and kind of hard-scrabbled and raw. There was nothing pretty about it. It was just patches of grass and crunchy snow, and nothing could have felt more real. Nothing's more real than those kind of days. That wintry feeling just gives it an even more bittersweet than usual flavoring for one of our shows. Nickelodeon opted not to renew The Adventures of Pete and Pete for a 4th season and aired its final new episode on April 1st, 1996. The show would remain in rerun rotation for another 3 years, including another brief stint on Snick, which is odd. Typically, Snick wanted new programming. Regular Pete and Pete reruns would end on February 27th, 1999. Around the same time, Nickelodeon was purging a lot of their early sitcoms, like Hey Dude and Salute Your Shorts. The landscape for this kind of show was changing. That was the time when Nickelodeon started to make the shift into making a lot more straight-down-the-middle mainstream programs. Ren and Stimpy was gone. It was the beginning of the Dan Schneider era. You could kind of see the writing on the wall that was the direction the network wanted to take their programming. Pete and Pete was always a struggle to keep on the air from the beginning. And once the network started making the shift into even more of a straight, crowd-pleasing show that needed to be for everyone, not just a group of passionate fans, it was going to be a lot harder for us to stay on the air. I don't want to say it didn't have a good run. 24 shorts, 5 specials, and 34 episodes over 7 years, that's not bad. And by 1996, The Adventures of Pete and Pete was facing the fate of pretty much every original live-action Nickelodeon show, the child cast aging out. The creators had an unprecedented level of creative freedom to make the show they wanted to make, a show that Laybourne's Nickelodeon seemed a bit uncomfortable with, and that Scannell's Nickelodeon didn't want at all. If the show had continued into 1997, it almost certainly would have been buried in executive meddling. And to demonstrate this, let's take a quick look at Snow Day.
1, 2, 3, 4.
With last night's record snowfall taking everyone by surprise, it seems the entire area has ground to a halt. Roads are blocked, businesses are shut down, and listen carefully, schools are officially closed for a snow day.
Premiering in theaters on February 11th, 2000, Snow Day was the 4th film made by Nickelodeon Movies, and was conceived years earlier as a potential Pete and Pete movie, with a screenplay written by Will McRobb and Chris Viscardi. By the time Nickelodeon got around to producing it, Pete and Pete had long been cancelled and the cast had all grown up, so the characters and locations were reworked, but the story mostly stayed the same. And once you learn it was supposed to be a Pete and Pete movie, it becomes so obvious. Snow Day tells the story of 2 siblings living in a sleepy East Coast suburb during a snow day, one of those mythical events every young person wishes to experience. The younger sibling is a flannel-wearing chaos gremlin who sets out to do the impossible on this mythical day and takes on a weird adult character trying to ruin things, who just happens to be played by Chris Elliott. Thankfully, the younger sibling has help from their friends, which includes a chubby boy named Wayne. The older sibling serves as our narrator through the story, and once upon a time, he might have joined the younger sibling in these shenanigans. Instead, he's interested in getting with a cute girl at school, going on a quest for her affections. The older sibling's lifelong best friend is this other girl, and they've been thick as thieves forever. But as the story goes on, both the older sibling and the older sibling's best friend start to realize they might have deeper feelings for each other. Supporting cast includes the siblings' put-upon parents, the younger sibling's antagonistic school principal, a bully and his squad, and Iggy Pop. It really is a triple-length Pete and Pete episode that just happens to have a different cast with different character names. You'd think that'd be pretty cool, but it just doesn't work nearly as well. Of course, it's not going to feel the same without the same cast, but the new cast isn't bad. Chevy Chase is kind of checked out, but like, when is that not true? I particularly liked Xena Gray as the girl version of Little Pete. I think she tapped into Little Pete's pride while making the role her own.
You've stolen your last snow day from us.
But the movie doesn't have time to establish the dynamics and history of these characters. It's hard to feel invested in these alternate universe versions of Big Pete and Ellen when you're just getting to know them. It's not even clear that the Ellen clone is a main character until halfway through the movie. But I think the reason Snow Day fails as a Pete and Pete adjacent work is because this is Pete and Pete made within the Nickelodeon system. It's a corporate remake of punk rock. Instead of Polaris or a similar indie rock band, we have 98 Degrees, Smash Mouth, and the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, music to sell a soundtrack album. Instead of a town full of weirdos, we have some basic 90s teen movie archetypes. The bully character who doesn't even have a cool name like Endless Mike, he's just Chuck. But the worst part, it's a small thing, but I think it's really indicative of the problem here. The worst part was the producers requesting the movie ADR in a bunch of fart noises into Wayne's scenes.
In Snow Day, what happened was they tested it, and as we learned, our style is not making people crack up. It's creating an atmosphere, a mood, and having things, kind of be magical. That isn't really what Paramount wanted. So they had to cut some stuff out that we loved. That was very, very Pete and Pete, because they had to figure out how to make it funnier. So they thought. There's a heavy set kid that's part of the little, our version of the little Pete gang. And there was 3 or 4 times where it seemed sort of believable because the kid was bending over or something. They would add a fart. And the remaining 20, there was no physical behavior that suggested that someone's going to fart. It would just be like drinking a glass of water, fart. Still crying about it, It just took our Pete and Pete universe and added the most cheapening, just crowd pleasing. And then the worst part was, and this is where I really, it took a little while to recover from this. I was standing by the copy machine when they were collating the audience review, cards that kids had. It was before the movie was released. They had kids watch it, and so I'm looking at these individual cards come up, and every time one came up, I could see the question, "What did you like best about the show?" And just chink, 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 and I would say 3/4 of 200 people said when the fat kid farted.
This is what Nickelodeon, as a company, wanted in the year 2000. Fat kids equal fart noises. I suppose we're lucky they were as hands-off on the Adventures of Pete and Pete as they were. Pete and Pete may be among the most beloved Nickelodeon programs for people of my generation, but I do not believe it was because of Nickelodeon. The most credit I think you can give to Nickelodeon, specifically Laybourne's Nickelodeon, was that they left the show alone.
Pete and Pete will be right back. Stay tuned.
The Adventures of Pete and Pete made a brief return to television as a premiere program on The N, Noggin's new programming block for teens. It aired there from April 1st, 2002 up through October 25th, 2003. The show would also occasionally pop up on You Pick Live, where kids would go online and vote for what shows would air on the channel. A stray broadcast on June 10th, 2004 would be the last time Pete and Pete would air on Nickelodeon.
How about putting a little Pete in your video library?
Don't chatter, musclehead!
And Big Pete, too, together in Classic Pete's, 2 of the original adventures of Pete and Pete that put 2 brothers with the same name on the map. First, it's what we did on our summer vacation when Pete and Pete and their best friend Ellen try to solve the mystery of Mr. Tasty's true identity. REM's Michael Stipe guest stars. Then, it's Apocalypse Pete, when Little Pete turns a harmless game into the Great Prank War.
Prepare to die, blowhole!
Plus, prepare yourself for arty aerobics and see why they've never been fit for public viewing until now. It's all part of the Adventures of Pete and Pete Classic Pete's. Add them to your collection.
You'll thank me for this someday.
Merchandise for the show was pretty non-existent, as you might expect. There were 3 VHS releases with 2 episodes on each tape. If you're lucky, you might get an original short starring Artie. Polaris managed to release a soundtrack album in April of 1999, right after the show had been taken off the air. And then there's the infamous DVDs. As previously mentioned in the Clarissa Explains It All video, in 2005, Nickelodeon kicked off the Nickelodeon Rewind DVD line, one of the first Nick products marketed on Nickelodeon nostalgia. The first 2 seasons of The Adventures of Pete and Pete would get DVD releases. Not the highest quality they could be. A few episodes have minor graphical issues, but it was still nice to have. A Season 3 DVD release was announced, and then just never happened. The reason for this has been oft speculated but never confirmed. According to McRobb and Viscardi, the DVDs were printed, complete with special features, but just ended up sitting in a warehouse for a while before presumably being destroyed. Thankfully, tape traders with television recordings have kept Season 3 from becoming lost media, which is good because the show has also never been available on streaming. The influence of The Adventures of Pete and Pete on Nickelodeon has been pretty minimal. While you can look at Clarissa Explains It All and point to a dozen shows like it, there's very little in Nick's history that feels Pete and Pete inspired. Not a whole lot of shows with a filmmaker's lens, not a lot of shows about confused emotions and hidden depths of everyday people. The shorts arguably had more influence on the channel than the full show, with how Nickelodeon managed original interstitial content in the following decade. During the show's production, Will McRobb would expand into the role of story editor for many of the early Nicktoons, working on Doug, Rocko's Modern Life, and The Ren and Stimpy Show, the latter of which would result in a whole ton of creative conflict with John Kay, but that's a story for another day. Will McRobb and Chris Viscardi would create one more show for the channel in 1996, Kablam, an animated sketch show featuring a wide range of comedy and animation styles that is quite different from their work on Pete and Pete. They did some producing and writing for Sanjay and Craig in 2013, and Viscardi would co-write the Loud House movie in 2021. Also, Snow Day was remade as a musical film in 2022, but that's just 1 degree more removed from Pete and Pete than I care to explore here. Catherine Diekman stepped away from television entirely after Pete and Pete, and has been writing and directing films since 2000. Arguably, Pete and Pete's biggest influence on the channel was giving them Danny Tamborelli. He would join the cast of All That in its 4th season, would become a regular panelist on the game show Figure It Out, and had a reoccurring role in the 1st season of 100 Deeds for Eddie McDowd. His time with Nick would end around the turn of the century, but he's kept acting, including playing Jimmy in Grand Theft Auto V. The rest of the cast moved on to things outside of Nickelodeon. Michael Morona taking on the role of slacker stock market savant Stewart in commercials for TD Ameritrade. Eventually, Morona would step behind the camera as a technician. Allison Finelli also retired from acting shortly after the series ended, starting medical school and is now a doctor. Hardy Rawls and Judy Graff continue to do some minor character and commercial work. Sadly, Graff passed away in 2021. Both Toby Huss and Damian Young have had very expansive careers over the years, as did Michelle Trachtenberg, who went on to Buffy the Vampire Slayer and starred in films like Eurotrip and Ice Princess. Despite being scooped by Nickelodeon as a potential homegrown star, she didn't do much work on Nickelodeon after Harriet the Spy, save for a few episodes of Figure It Out. From the very beginning to this very day, the relationship between Nickelodeon and The Adventures of Pete and Pete has been an uncomfortable one. A show that came from outside the system and a channel that felt pressured into making it. A show with a small but fervent fanbase and a channel that didn't feel compelled to target that fanbase. A show that tried something weird and new, and a channel that was more interested in fart jokes. 2, 3, 4! When I was little, the thing I wanted to be most when I grew up was the Tooth Fairy. See, I learned pretty early on that things like the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny weren't real. I figured it out a lot younger than most kids do. See, I was a bit of a ninja toddler. I woke up to noises easily and would sneak around the house when I thought everyone was asleep. I used to get up at 3 in the morning and grab a cookie in the kitchen without anyone noticing, or go to the rec room, turn on the TV with the volume set to the lowest it could go, and watch late night movies with my ears pressed against the speaker. And sure enough, my little stealth missions had me witnessing Dad putting out the Christmas presents, Mom hiding eggs in the lawn. But this didn't really kill the holiday spirit for me. If anything, it made me appreciate the work and craft my parents put into these mythical beings our childhood revolved around. And I wanted to participate in that. In the same way that watching behind-the-scenes footage of movies got me interested in filmmaking. As a child, I didn't exactly have the budget to be Santa Claus. I made $1 a week drying dishes, and I wasn't old enough for a paper route. But I could be the Tooth Fairy. A quarter under the pillow whenever one of my siblings lost a baby tooth? I could do that. And my opportunity would come soon enough when one of my little brother's bottom teeth started doing its little hula dance, warning of its inevitable divorce from the gums. Now, my parents were still playing the role of Tooth Fairy, but I had a plan. I'd swipe the quarter they left and replace it with something my brother really wanted. See, he was a huge fan of portable beasties. He played the video games, he watched the cartoon, it was his everything. And the crown jewel of portable beasties was the rare silver foil Wen3 collector's coin, which you only have a 1 in 100,000 chance of getting when you open a portable beasties booster coin tube. But I knew somebody who had one, a freshman by the name of Rabbit Master. They called him that because his family kept nearly 100 rabbits in their backyard, and Rabbit Master would make and sell lucky rabbit's feet at school. I never knew if they were real rabbit's feet or not. Rabbit Master was a huge collector of portable beasties and had a rare silver foil Wen3 collector's coin. I had nothing to trade the coin with, didn't have so much as bubblegum money, so I approached him as he sat lazily on a lawn chair in his garage, drinking a pouched fruit juice drink and reading a car magazine, and I challenged him to a duel. I want that rare silver foil Wen3 collector's coin. You pick the contest, anything you want, and if I win, I get it, and if I lose, I'll clean all the rabbit bins for 3 months. Rabbit Master agreed, and challenged me to a foot race around the block. Now, I'm not slow, but this kid had 6 years and nearly 1.5 feet on me, so he quickly sped past. What's worse, my lace on my ratty old sneaker had come undone, and I quickly tripped and fell forward onto the sidewalk. Oh no! I wasn't really hurt, but as Rabbit Master turned around to see what had happened, I was struck with inspiration. I bent my hitchhiker's thumb as far as it would go, and I started crying in a way I hadn't since the epic hot potato battle. My 2 superpowers combined, Rabbit Master started to panic. He thought I, a little kid, had really hurt themselves in this stupid race over a stupid portable beasties toy. His parents were gonna kill him. He tried to shush me up, but I kept crying and bawling my eyes out, showing off my twisted, broken thumb for any bystanders to witness. Rabbit Master quickly snatched the rare silver foil Wen3 collector's coin out of his backpack, stuffed it into my hand, and told me to go home. I stopped crying halfway there. Didn't even have red eyes when I got to the house. My brother's tooth fell out, and he put it under his pillow. My parents replaced the tooth with a quarter while he slept, and I snuck in and replaced the quarter with the rare silver foil Wen3's collector's coin. Then went back to bed, excited about how happy he'd be when he saw what the Tooth Fairy had left him. I woke up, went to the dining room for Cocoa Pops, only to see through the window my brother chucking the rare silver foil Wen3 collector's coin over the fence and into the neighbor's yard. I screamed and ran out into the backyard. "Why did you do that?" I asked. He looked at me cold and told me that he didn't believe in the Tooth Fairy anymore. The Tooth Fairy doesn't leave rare silver foil Wen3 collector's coins in place of your teeth. She leaves a quarter. The Tooth Fairy had broken the rules, and now my brother couldn't believe. I hadn't realized how important those traditions of Santa Claus and Easter bunnies and tooth fairies were to him and so many other kids, and how fragile that illusion was. How fragile childhood was.
I could always find in the shows I was working on something that was connected to my overall emotional a connection with shows that I loved, and that typically involved. It eventually became kind of like a catchphrase from Chris Viscardi and I. We were doing Pete and Pete, but we kind of boiled down our whole aesthetic. And if you have all 4 of these ingredients, then you're onto something. Whether you're watching something or trying to write something, and that was funny, sad, strange, and beautiful. I couldn't always be doing that, but whenever I had a chance to kind of find those 4 ingredients, that's what I would promote.
Bill's the master of getting milk to shoot out of Teddy's nose. So every lunch, Teddy wears a nose clip. That is, every lunch since the bath.
And the guy says, "It's just a small load, so I'll drop it here."
Bill says his new goal is to make milk come out of Teddy's ears.
One common comparison I've seen with the Adventures of Pete and Pete is Twin Peaks meets The Wonder Years. And I can totally see how you'd get that. Twin Peaks took small-town America and filled it with characters off-kilter, creating a muddy juxtaposition of the ordinary and the strange. You could take Twin Peaks Log Lady, put her in Wellsville, and she'd fit right in as if she always belonged there. The Wonder Years, on the other hand, married suburban baby boomer nostalgia with young teen drama, framed in narration and featuring a will-they, won't-they romance that, spoilers, ultimately ends with the boy and the girl not getting together. While the specifics are different, The Wonder Years and Pete and Pete share a lot of broad story beats, the story of Kevin Arnold and the story of Big Pete Wrigley having interesting parallels. A young person discovering the complexities of the adults around them, a modern son's relationship with an old-fashioned father, a first kiss far too early. Twin Peaks meets The Wonder Years is definitely an apt comparison, but perhaps an incidental one. The Pete and Pete shorts predate Twin Peaks by a year, and The Wonder Years is about a very specific, real time and place, while Pete and Pete aims to be more contemporary. While I believe the three shows were all part of the same zeitgeist and certainly fed into each other, the creators of Pete and Pete have never referenced Twin Peaks or The Wonder Years as influences. In fact, quite the opposite. Will McRobb rejecting the Twin Peak comparison in an article for the Daily News back in 1993. If your show is a little weird, which I guess ours is, it seems it's described as either crossed with Twin Peaks or it's something on acid. But our show isn't meant to be a spoof. The Petes might do strange things, but we treat them seriously. In the same article, Chris Viscardi provides 3 alternative influences that feel less obvious at first. Pee-wee's Playhouse, A Christmas Story, and A Catcher in the Rye. Pee-wee's Playhouse, Paul Rubin's wacky children's show, is far sillier than Pete and Pete, a live-action cartoon with almost every inanimate object turned into a puppet character, adults acting like children, and a talk-to-the-camera style of hosting that evoked older kids' shows like Romper Room or Captain Kangaroo. In fact, Pee-wee's Playhouse was very much Rubin's spin on the shows he had grown up with. Howdy Doody, The Mickey Mouse Club, Rocky and Bullwinkle. Much of the supporting human cast are either pastiches of 1950s styles, or are the kind of characters you would see in a local kids show that lead into cheap Looney Tunes shorts. So in its own way, Pee-wee's Playhouse was also baby boomers processing the weirdness of what they grew up with. Reflective television from the first generation to grow up with television. But I think the most obvious parallel between Pee-wee's Playhouse and the Adventures of Pete and Pete is Artie, very much an attempt to replicate the Pee-wee Herman formula. Both Pee-wee and Artie were goofy man-child characters originating from independent comedy theater, who managed to stumble their way into a television show. Artie wasn't Pete and Pete's main character, but he was their most marketable character, at least in the limited ways the show was marketed. Some of those Pete and Pete VHS releases had exclusive Artie shorts, so that was cool.
Your lungs, your heart, your tonsils. Aerobics the Artie way makes everything feel good.
A Christmas Story is a more obvious reference point. It has many parallels to both Pete and Pete and The Wonder Years. The young narrator, the use of nostalgia, the dad who acts all tough, and the put-upon housewife. A Christmas Story opts for 40s nostalgia, no longer pandering to the baby boomer generation, but the bones are all there. If The Wonder Years was a model for Big Pete's story, A Christmas Story is a model for Little Pete's stories. A younger kid struggling against the world of adults, discovering how much of it is fake and how much of it are lessons actually worth learning. And speaking of Little Pete, there's A Catcher in the Rye, which is, not a comedy, though it is perhaps taken more seriously than it should be. J.D. Salinger's famous 1951 novel is largely an adolescent scream, the angst of a child who's at that age where they think they know everything, but in fact know very little. Chris Viscardi compares Little Pete to Holden Caulfield, and yeah, I see it. The rage against a machine you don't know the shape of, the valuing of authenticity, the ego that knows what's best for itself but refuses to do it anyway out of principle. The substance of the two characters are very different, but the essence is actually pretty similar. And perhaps one can see the book's youthful ideas of authenticity and phoniness reflected in how the show breaks down its authority figures, only to get the opposite results. It's not that the grown-ups are phonies, it's that they're way more complicated and human than the boxes society put them in. It's of course foolish to try and tie things to a singular inspiration and say, it's a take on that. Like all art, The Adventures of Pete and Pete can be seen as an amalgamation of dozens of influences to form a unique whole. But I think perhaps a more apt way to see it is that Pete and Pete flows down the same river as these other works, finding the humor in Americana absurdity, nostalgic weirdness, and the oft-wrong expectations of how you're supposed to live your life.
We've got a second chance. We can live the hour over again.
After what you did to me?
I know. I'm sorry. I kind of got lost in the future. I know that sounds weird, but now I'm back. And all I want to do is go back to when... Ellen... I just want to be friends again.
My favorite movie of 2024 so far is I Saw the TV Glow. Written and directed by Jane Shelbrun, this little horror film tells the story of two kids in the 1990s, Owen and Maddie, who make a connection through a young adult urban fantasy television show called The Pink Opaque, a show about two teenage girls, Isabel and Tara, who form a supernatural bond over summer camp and fight against the forces of evil. Owen and Maddie's bond is fraught as they struggle with family issues, social outcasting, and their own queer and trans identities, and start to see the Pink Opaque as an escape, or perhaps even a world more real than their own. The show within a show is a pastiche of different 90s kids shows that drew small but dedicated audiences. Buffy the Vampire Slayer is the most obvious reference point for the Pink Opaque, but you could list dozens of 90s kids shows that this fictional program evokes, from Erie, Indiana, to Sailor Moon, to Are You Afraid of the Dark, to Round the Twist. And there's a lot of Nickelodeon in there. Look at that credits font. That's the most mid-90s Snick show font. However, while the Pink Opaque evokes a lot of 90s kid shows to place it in a specific time period and explore the connections people of my generation made with television, there aren't many direct references to these old shows. Except for one textual moment where millennials like me are meant to sit up and point at the screen and go, "Oh, that's a very specific IP from my childhood." Spoilers for I Saw the TV Glow ahead. It's now been some years after high school. The Pink Opaque has long been cancelled, and Owen crosses paths with Maddie for the first time in a long time. She's different, acting strange, suggesting that the Pink Opaque was more than just a show, and that it's actually reality, and that this world is the fiction, and that Maddie and Owen's roles in all of this may be way deeper than just two kids who watched a TV show together. To explain things further, Maddie asks Owen to meet her in the middle of the night, but when Owen leaves his house, he finds two ghostly figures waiting for him. If you don't recognize them, you're probably put off by these two pale, middle-aged men whom we've never seen before and will never see again. If you're like me, you went, "Whoa, was that Michael Morona and Danny Tamborelli?" The Petes, all grown up and ghostly white, just stare directly at Owen, into the camera. We've never seen them before in the movie, and we never see them again. They don't have character names, no lines of dialogue, no plot significance, only thematic weight tied to the knowledge of who these two actors are. It's not the only cameo in the film. Amber Benson, who played Tara in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, also has a small role, but as an actual character. It's not quite as jarring or obviously symbolic as the Petes are here. So, just what are they doing here? For me, it was just all about the uncanny nature of aging. Seeing child actors as adults together, as almost these specters on the same suburban streets where they used to be kids on television, felt really ripe. I Saw the TV Glow deals with isolation and the expectations of society, and a lot of the Adventures of Pete and Pete deal with that as well. The show is full of characters who are separated from possible community due to their eccentricities, due to what makes them themselves. A boy who may or may not be an alien, a crossing guard who takes his job too seriously, an anonymous ice cream man who values his privacy, an underwear inspector sworn to secrecy, the barber who doesn't like to chat, even one of Big Pete's close friends who's just a little too weird to be around for long stretches of time. The characters of I Saw the TV Glow deal with similar emotions, similar separations, in a similar suburban environment. The difference is that these characters are isolated through the societal expectations of heteronormativity, and they don't have a Big Pete or a Little Pete or an Ellen to make a connection with. Except that's not entirely true. Owen and Maddie just might have each other, if they're brave enough to accept themselves. I won't spoil any more than that. It's a great movie, a sad, distressing movie. I highly recommend it. While a lot of different shows echo through the fictional television program within the movie, the adventures of Pete and Pete echo through the movie itself, haunts it with both a path in which the characters can save themselves and a warning on the passage of time, that we are not locked into youth like the characters on the screen. We will grow old. We will run out of time. But we haven't yet.
Disrupt their families? Gutter lover! Blue legless dog ball! Take this! Ah! Wow! Oh, please! Ah!
The Adventures of Pete and Pete is one of the first shows we've talked about on Knacks that corresponded with the early rise of the internet. And the first Pete and Pete fan site, known simply as the website of Pete and Pete, was put up on the Indiana University Bloomington servers on August 2nd, 1994, between the show's first and second season. The earliest version of the website on the Wayback Machine is for June 9th, 1997, a year after the show's final episode. It's a pretty bare-bones HTML from scratch website from the early days of the World Wide Web. Black text on a white background, an episode guide, a photo gallery, a page of quotes. The most interesting page, however, is Fan Analysis and Opinion, in which people emailed in their thoughts on the show. And it's the closest thing I can get to contemporary thoughts on the Adventures of Pete and Pete as it was airing. And I'd like to share a few samples. If you think this video is overanalyzing the show, well, it turns out people have been this invested in it since the very beginning. In the episode Nightcrawlers, Pete and what few Nightcrawlers remain after a week lounge, dazed on the curbside. A quick pan up shows Joyce Wrigley strolling down the sidewalk, carrying groceries and whistling, as she not so coincidentally passes her erstwhile son and his gang. With a tone that can only be described as honey-coated razor blades, she says,
Isn't it a wonderful morning?
And glances pointedly at Pete. The young Viking is down for the count. His forces are sadly depleted. His will is sapped. He is on the brink of surrender when his mother says this. To a weaker man, say, older Pete, the triumph in that condescending remark would be enough to sway his stance.
Dawn was better.
From under that fiery stare comes the simple defiance that is Pete. Dawn was better. When I first saw this, I was stunned. In less than 15 seconds, the show had summed up all that is virtuous about man. Loyalty to principle, willingness to suffer, and a stout heart in the face of overwhelming odds, and placed that summary in the words of a 10-year-old boy. From the opening credits, the strange fractions of scenes that flash by foreshadow the show's unreal and uncanny situations, all while a groovy tune is being hammered out by Polaris. Playing on the front lawn of the Wrigley estate, the band has an energy that can also be found within the rest of the program's 30 minutes. However, behind all these abstract adventures, almost always a moral can be found. This is what strikes me as one of the most amazing aspects of the show. By going beyond the borders of reality, the writers can emphasize important lessons more realistically. When reality is stretched a little, the adventures resemble more of a tall tale. But that is what The Adventures of Pete and Pete is, a modern fable. Anyhow, any kid I know would tell me that Pete and Pete was much more intriguing than A Tortoise and the Hare. What I find most appealing about the series in general is the fact that the theme of the underdog overcoming unfavorable odds is always present. Whether it is the younger or older Pete, they both are faced with a dilemma and always seem to surmount it. But ultimately, what makes the series so appealing is that in the process of overcoming these conflicts, they have learned something about themselves in the process. For example, in the episode Day of the Dot, Pete in the end does lead the band to a Wellsville championship, but the real accomplishment is the fact that in the process, Pete stood up to a bully, discovered his need for more than a friendship with Ellen, and learned authority figures like Mr. Markle aren't always right. What makes Pete and Pete an exceptional series is the way it communicates to all of us. We all can sympathize with their problems. Overcoming bullying of any sort, whether from a peer or authority figure, is a major accomplishment, while discovering love in platonic relationships can be one of the hardest things to do. Pete and his little brother Pete are all of us. They face all of our problems, and we learn from these problems. That is the show's appeal.
Okay, kiddos, come on, I got a long drive ahead of me. Now, don't worry, I'll be back. First hot day, like always. Till then, I was wondering...
Yeah?
Could I get a shot of all of us together? It'd mean a lot to me.
Sure.
Great.
Despite its lack of support after cancellation, no streaming, no Season 3 DVDs, The Adventures of Pete and Pete maintains a solid cult fan base, keeping the show alive into the 21st century. There were cast reunions in 2011 and 2012, the latter of which included Polaris reuniting for the first time since 1996. Polaris would go on tour shortly after and start releasing new music again, along with a re-release of the show's soundtrack album with never-before-heard demos as bonus material. Michael Morona and Danny Tamborelli have remained friends, and in 2013 began a monthly podcast. This spun off into a stage show, Nostalgia Personified, in which child actors, often Nickelodeon child actors like Lori Beth Denberg, discuss their time in the spotlight. On June 17th and 18th, 2017, Nick Splat hosted a Pete and Pete marathon, hosted by Morona and Tamborelli, who gave their insights on the show during commercial breaks, bringing the two back to the world of interstitials. This marks the final time The Adventures of Pete and Pete have aired on television. There were shows that were more successful for Nickelodeon, shows that had a larger impact on the channel, shows with more merchandise, shows with longer runs, shows better preserved, but I don't think there's a Nickelodeon show more loved than The Adventures of Pete and Pete. Those who love it with all their heart. It's a show with an indie rock spirit, a Nickelodeon show made just outside the margins of the Nickelodeon system by talented weirdos. It's a show about empathy, about the complexities of growing up, of friendship and family, and of having your own personal superhero. Next time, we make a return to Nick Jr. for another anime import. This one is about little magical people who live in the forest. But don't worry, it has a happier ending than David the Gnome. There were a lot of sources for this video, but the backbone of it all comes from the AV Club article exploring the adventures of Pete and Pete's genesis and highlights, in which Will McRobb and Chris Viscardi go through the show's entire history and talk about select episodes in detail. It's totally worth a read. There's a link in the description below. Thank you all for watching. Sorry it took so long, but if you haven't been checking my socials, well, I'm kinda homeless right now. If you'd like to support Knacks and other Pop Arena projects, consider contributing to my Patreon. Every dollar goes to food and shelter. You can also support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, hitting that bell icon for notifications, sending a one-time donation through PayPal or Ko-fi, and sharing Knacks with all your friends. Thank you again, and remember, Black Lives Matter.